A family weekend trip seemed to end like any other. A couple and their young son were heading home after spending a few days at the beach, driving along a highway in the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. But at some point along that journey, something happened that meant the family that had set off together would not return whole. What started as a report of an alleged highway kidnapping soon turned into an investigation full of doubts, contradictions, and unexpected twists. Over time, authorities would conclude that the person responsible for the crime was someone who knew very well how criminal investigations worked, and who tried to use that knowledge to construct a story capable of fooling everyone. Someone who was much closer to the family circle than anyone could have imagined. The case of María del Pilar Garrido. Every day we live alongside evil. We witness the darkest side of human behavior. The suffering inflicted by one individual on others is a constant presence in our society. On Criminal Investigators, we will delve into that dark side of humanity. We will bring the most perverse crimes to the screen and try to get inside the minds of those who commit the most terrible acts. I'm Alex, and today I bring you another case. But before we begin, I want you to tell me where you're watching us from. We really like to know how far these stories reach. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share this video if you think someone else might be interested. And now, let's begin. Sunday, July 2nd, 2017, seemed to be a completely normal day for a family returning home after spending the weekend at a beach in the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. María del Pilar Garrido, her husband Jorge Fernández, and their young son set off on their way back to Ciudad Victoria. The drive wasn't particularly long and was part of a routine that many families go through at the end of a relaxing weekend. However, during that return trip, something happened that would change the fate of that family forever. When the family vehicle finally arrived in Ciudad Victoria that night, the three family members who had set off together to enjoy the weekend were no longer inside. Only two returned home. Pilar had disappeared on the way, and what had happened during that journey would begin to be reconstructed based on the version given by her own husband. The day after that trip, Jorge Fernández went to the authorities to report his wife's disappearance. According to his account, while they were returning along the highway, a sand-colored vehicle cut them off, forcing him to stop. Several men armed with long rifles got out of that car and, according to his version, began giving them instructions under threat. Jorge claimed that the men ordered him to get out of the car and that apparently, at that first moment, they hadn't realized that Pilar and the couple's baby were traveling in the back seat. As he explained, the men seemed interested only in taking the vehicle. He told them that was fine, but first he needed to get his son out, a baby of just 1 year, who was in the back. It was then that the men approached the car and discovered that Pilar was also inside. At that moment, the situation changed completely. The alleged kidnappers took Pilar by the arm and forced her into the vehicle they were traveling in. But before leaving, they told Jorge not to go to the police and that they would contact him in about 24 hours to demand a ransom. The car with the armed men sped away in the opposite direction to the one Jorge and his family were traveling. From that moment on, according to his version, he never saw his wife again. When Jorge went to the authorities to report Pilar's disappearance, one of the first questions that arose was why he had waited several hours before going to the police. As he explained, after what happened, he continued on his way to Ciudad Victoria with his son, and both were extremely tired after the long day of travel. The man claimed that he did try to go to a prosecutor's office near his house that same night, accompanied by his father. But when they arrived, it was already very late, and there was no staff available to take the formal report. For that reason, he decided to go back home and wait until the next morning to report what happened. At that point, authorities interpreted the case as a possible express kidnapping, a type of crime that was relatively common in certain areas of the state of Tamaulipas during those years. For that reason, they chose to keep the information confidential and not immediately launch a public search, as they believed doing so could put Pilar's life in danger if the kidnappers were planning to contact the family to demand a ransom. As the days passed, investigators waited for the call that those responsible would supposedly make to negotiate the woman's release. However, time began to pass without anyone calling to ask for money or give any sign that Pilar was still alive, a circumstance that gradually began to generate new concerns about what had really happened that night on the highway. The days began to pass without any call being made. A week after the disappearance, the situation began to seem increasingly strange to investigators. Given the total lack of contact from the alleged kidnappers, authorities decided to change the focus of the case and officially treat it as a disappearance. Meanwhile, search operations were deployed in the area where Jorge said the kidnapping took place. And members of the federal police and the state anti-kidnapping coordination participated in the searches, which included land and air sweeps and the use of specialized search dogs. The search teams covered a perimeter of between 10 and 12 kilometers around the point indicated by Jorge. During those inspections, they located some places that seemed to have been used by criminal groups. But none of those findings allowed for a direct connection to Pilar's disappearance, so uncertainty continued to grow as the days went by. While authorities continued trying to reconstruct what happened, new elements emerged in the case. Jorge even provided descriptions of two young men who, according to him, had participated in the alleged kidnapping, which allowed authorities to draw up a composite sketch based on his statements. Over time, one of the individuals pointed out by Jorge was identified as a young man who had escaped from a juvenile detention center. Later, another of the alleged accomplices was found dead in circumstances that, according to authorities, showed signs of having been executed by hitmen. The body appeared in a municipality relatively close to where the kidnapping was said to have occurred. Shortly after that discovery, investigators found human remains belonging to a woman. The body was in a state of decomposition that strongly caught the attention of forensic specialists, as some parts still had tissue while others were practically reduced to bone. Several personal items were also found at the scene, including a watch and a swimsuit. DNA tests carried out later confirmed that the remains belonged to Jorge's wife. The forensic analysis also revealed that the woman had died of strangulation and had facial injuries, including fractures to her nose and some skull bones. With this discovery, the investigation stopped being treated as a kidnapping and began to focus on a possible homicide. But to truly understand what happened on that Tamaulipas highway, we first need to pause for a moment and find out who the woman was whose life ended so violently that night. Behind the name that was starting to appear in the headlines, there was a personal story, a family, and a life path that had begun far away from Mexico. Maria del Pilar Garrido Santamans was originally from the municipality of Masalaves, in the province of Valencia, Spain. Those who knew her described her as committed to social causes and motivated by an interest in the reality around her. She decided to study journalism at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. It was during her university years that she met Jorge Fernández González, a Mexican student who was in Spain on an academic exchange studying criminology. The relationship between them began as a friendship that over time turned into a romantic relationship that would eventually lead to marriage. For several years, the couple lived in Spain, even sharing a home with Pilar's mother. However, Jorge found it difficult to find stable job opportunities in that country, and faced with that situation, he decided to return to Mexico to try to build his professional career there. Shortly after, Pilar decided to join him, and they both settled in the state of Tamaulipas. There, Jorge got a job as a professor at the University of Security and Justice, while Pilar tried to adapt to her new life in an environment very different from the one she had known in Spain. Over the years, the couple had a son who became the center of their family life and the reason for many of the plans they had begun to build together. Pilar's life in Mexico was very different from the one she had in Spain, because the state of Tamaulipas, where the couple settled, is a border region with the United States that for many years has been marked by the presence of criminal groups linked to drug trafficking. In that context, practicing journalism could become a particularly dangerous activity, something Pilar quickly understood. For that reason, she decided to direct her efforts toward other activities that would allow her to contribute to the family economy without exposing herself to the risks that her profession involved in that region. At the time of the events, Pilar was preparing a small business related to the sale of creams, a personal project with which she hoped to start a new phase of her career. Meanwhile, Jorge seemed to have found some professional stability and, according to some testimonies, had also been involved with the state's C4, the system responsible for coordinating information and response to security incidents. To those around them, they were a young family trying to build their life in Mexico while maintaining their connection to Spain, a country to which Pilar remained deeply attached. But while authorities continued to reconstruct the events and try to understand what had really happened that night on the highway, some elements in the investigation began to raise new questions. Details that at first seemed secondary began to be reviewed more closely, and gradually, investigators' attention began to turn toward a person who had been present from the very beginning of the story. After Pilar's body was identified, and it was confirmed that her death had been caused by strangulation, investigators began to completely rethink the focus of the case. The method used to take her life did not match the type of violence typically used by organized crime groups in the region, leading officers to consider other possible hypotheses. In this context, the focus of the investigation began to turn toward Jorge Fernandez, though this was not an immediate accusation, but rather a line of inquiry that in many cases is explored first, since the romantic partner is usually one of the last people to see the victim alive. Investigators then began to analyze more closely the circumstances surrounding Pilar's disappearance and the version Jorge had presented of the alleged kidnapping. Some elements began to catch the officers' attention and raise doubts that until then had not been considered. One of those elements was the condition of the family car. When authorities asked for the keys to inspect it, they discovered that the vehicle had been thoroughly washed. And when asked why he had cleaned it so soon after the events, Jorge replied that the car was very dirty and he had decided to wash it. An explanation that was also supported by his father, who claimed that the vehicle had been taken to a friend to be cleaned. As the investigations progressed, specialists began to review phone records and security cameras installed on some roads in the region. One of the details that caught investigators' attention was that Jorge's phone had remained turned off throughout the night the kidnapping supposedly took place. Since it was not active, it was not possible to track his location through cell phone towers. Pilar's phone, on the other hand, did remain turned on during part of the journey, and records allowed her signal to be tracked to an area that later matched the place where her body was found. After that moment, the device also stopped transmitting a signal. To this was added information captured by a road safety camera that recorded Jorge's vehicle arriving in Ciudad Victoria approximately an hour later than he had declared. Comparing the distance between the point where the kidnapping supposedly occurred and the location of the camera, investigators concluded that the time spent on the journey was longer than expected. Initially, Jorge had claimed that he had not stopped anywhere along the way. Later, he explained that he had taken a different route to return to the city, which he claimed justified the delay. For investigators, however, these variations in his story began to feed growing doubts about what had really happened that night. With the progress of the investigations and the analysis of the various elements gathered by authorities, the Tamaulipas State Prosecutor's Office publicly announced that it considered Jorge Fernandez the main suspect in Pilar's murder. On August 29, 2017, at a press conference, the prosecutor reported that there was sufficient evidence to proceed with his arrest for the crime of femicide. The news had a strong impact on those who knew the couple, and while authorities defended their decision based on the inconsistencies detected during the investigation, several people close to Jorge quickly came to his defense. His parents were the first to do so, stating that their son was not a violent person and that his marriage to Pilar had always been stable and happy. According to them, they had never witnessed serious arguments between the couple and claimed that the birth of their son had strengthened their relationship even further. For Jorge's parents, the idea that their son could have committed a crime of that magnitude simply made no sense. But Jorge's defense didn't come only from his family, as some members of Pilar's family also initially expressed doubts about the accusation. Pilar's mother, Rosa Maria, traveled to Tamaulipas shortly after learning of her daughter's disappearance, and for a time stated to the media that she did not believe her son-in-law was capable of hurting her. The judicial process against Jorge began on August 30, 2018, and the prosecutor's office claimed to have a broad set of evidence and testimonies that, according to their case, proved the defendant's responsibility for his wife's death. After Jorge's arrest, Pilar's mother returned to Spain with her grandson, who remained in her custody while the judicial process continued. Among the evidence presented were computer analyses, expert studies, and witness statements. One of the experts explained that in the days leading up to the crime, Jorge had made several trips between Ciudad Victoria and Soto La Marina, the same route the family had traveled on the day of the disappearance. Another specialist confirmed that the route Jorge said he took to return to the city did not match the records analyzed during the investigation. Throughout the trial, situations also arose that caused delays and tension within the process. At one point, it was discovered that some members of the initial defense team did not have legal licenses to practice law, forcing additional reviews of the procedure. Furthermore, in December of that same year, 2 crimes occurred that indirectly affected the case. One of the judges linked to the process and a member of the prosecutor's office were shot, leading to the temporary suspension of several hearings. Although the defense claimed those events were not related to the trial, the situation created an atmosphere of uncertainty that delayed the progress of the judicial process. After the presentation of evidence and testimonies by both sides, the court finally delivered its verdict. By unanimous decision, Jorge Fernandez was found guilty of the murder of Maria del Pilar Garrido and sentenced to 47 years in prison for the crime of femicide. In addition to the prison sentence, the ruling included the payment of a fine to cover funeral expenses and compensation for the victim's family. He was also ordered to forfeit parental rights over his son and any inheritance rights related to assets shared with Pilar. The defendant's defense reacted immediately, calling the ruling unjust and announcing that they would file legal appeals to challenge the sentence. His lawyers argued that there were irregularities in the process and maintained that the evidence presented did not definitively prove Jorge's guilt. In September 2021, the case took a new turn when a federal court granted an injunction that overturned the original sentence. This did not mean Jorge's immediate release, but rather ordered a review of part of the judicial process, particularly the situation of the first lawyers who participated in his defense. However, after the procedure was repeated, in 2022, a court once again upheld the 47-year prison sentence against Jorge Fernandez for the femicide of Maria del Pilar Garrido. This meant that the injunction did not change the final outcome of the case, so Jorge remains imprisoned in the Ciudad Victoria Sanctions Execution Center, serving his sentence for the crime against his wife. Maria del Pilar's story ended in a way no one imagined when she decided to start a new life far from her country. A woman who had left Spain to start a family ended up losing her life violently in a place where she sought to build a future with her husband and son. And although justice ended up pointing to the person it considered responsible, The tragedy leaves a wound that is hard to heal for those who knew Pilar and for her family, who had to face an irreparable loss thousands of miles from home. Cases like this also remind us that often the most devastating tragedies do not happen in unfamiliar places, but within the closest circle of trust. That is why, beyond the sentence and the years in prison, we are left to reflect on how fragile human relationships can be when conflict, jealousy, or hidden tensions are mixed in. Because behind every court file, there is always a life story that ended too soon. And well, dear audience, that's another investigation. What do you think of today's case? We would love to read your comments, as your opinion on the cases is very important to us. Remember to always do so with the utmost respect, both for the victim and for other viewers and us who will be reading them. Before you go, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, don't forget to share this video if you think someone you know might be interested. See you in another criminal investigation. Goodbye.